During World War II, the United States and the Soviet Union fought together as allies against the Axis powers. However, the relationship between the two nations was quite a tense one. Americans had long been wary of Soviet communism and concerned about Russian leader Joseph Stalin's cruel, bloodthirsty rule of his own country. For their part, the Soviets resented the Americans' decades-long refusal to treat the USSR as a legitimate part of the international community, as well as their delayed entry into World War II, which unfortunately resulted in the deaths of tens of millions of Russians. After the war ended, these grievances ripened into an overwhelming sense of mutual distrust and enmity. Post-war Soviet expansionism in Eastern Europe fueled many Americans' fears of a Russian plan to control the world. Meanwhile, the USSR came to resent what they perceived as American officials' bellicose rhetoric, arms buildup, and interventionist approach to international relations. In such a hostile atmosphere, no single party was entirely to blame for the Cold War. In fact, some historians believe it was inevitable. By the time World War II ended, most American officials agreed that the best defense against the Soviet threat was a strategy called containment. In 1946, in his famous Long Telegram, the diplomat George Kennan explained this policy. The Soviet Union, he wrote, was a political force committed fanatically to the belief that with the United States, there can be no permanent modus vivendi. As a result, America's only choice was a long-term, patient, but firm and vigilant containment of Russian expansive tendencies. President Harry Truman agreed, and in 1947, before the Congress, he declared, "It must be the policy of the United States to support free peoples who are resisting attempted subjugation by outside pressures." This way of thinking would shape American foreign policy for the next 4 decades. The containment strategy also provided the rationale for an unprecedented arms buildup in the United States. In 1950, a National Security Council report known as NSC 68 had echoed Truman's recommendation that the country use military force to contain communist expansionism anywhere it seemed to be occurring. To that end, the report called for a 4-fold increase in defense spending. In particular, American officials encouraged the development of atomic bombs, like the ones that had ended World War II. Thus began a deadly arms race. In 1949, the Soviets tested an atom bomb of their own. In response, President Truman announced that the United States would build an even more destructive atomic weapon, the hydrogen bomb. As a result, the stakes of the Cold War were perilously high. The first hydrogen bomb test in the Eniwetok Atoll in the Marshall Islands showed just how fearsome the nuclear age could be. It created a 25-square-mile fireball that vaporized an island, blew a huge hole in the ocean floor, and had the power to destroy half of Manhattan. Subsequent American and Soviet tests spewed poisonous radioactive waste into the atmosphere. The ever-present threat of nuclear annihilation had a great impact on American domestic life as well. People built bomb shelters in their backyards. They practiced attack drills in schools and other public places. The 1950s and 1960s saw an epidemic of popular films that horrified moviegoers with depictions of nuclear devastation and mutant creatures. In these and other ways, the Cold War was a constant presence in Americans' everyday lives. Space exploration served as another dramatic arena for Cold War competition. On October the 4th of 1957, a Soviet R-7 intercontinental ballistic missile launched Sputnik, the world's first artificial satellite and the first man-made object to be placed into the Earth's orbit. Sputnik's launch came as a surprise, and not a pleasant one to most Americans. In the United States, space was seen as the next frontier, a logical extension of the ground American tradition of exploration, and it was crucial not to lose too much ground to the Soviets. In addition, this demonstration of the overwhelming power of the R-7 missile, seemingly capable of delivering a nuclear warhead into the United States airspace, made gathering intelligence about Soviet military activities particularly urgent. In 1958, the United States launched its own satellite, Explorer 1, designed by the United States Army under the direction of rocket scientist Wernher von Braun, and what came to be known as the space race was underway. That same year, President Dwight Eisenhower signed a public order creating NASA, a federal agency dedicated to space exploration, as well as several programs seeking to exploit the military potential of space. Still, the Soviets were one step ahead, launching the first man into space in April of 1961. That May, after Alan Shepard became the first American man in space, President John F. Kennedy made the bold public claim that the United States would land a man on the moon by the end of the decade. And on July the 20th of 1969, his prediction came true when Neil Armstrong of NASA's Apollo 11 mission became the first man to set foot on the moon, effectively winning the space race for the Americans. US astronauts came to be seen as the ultimate American heroes, and earthbound men and women seemed to enjoy living vicariously through them. Soviets in turn were pictured as the ultimate villains, with their massive, relentless efforts to surpass America and prove the power of the communist system. Meanwhile, beginning in 1947, the House Un-American Activities Committee brought the Cold War home in another way. The committee began a series of hearings designed to show the communist subversion in the United States was alive and well. In Hollywood, the committee forced hundreds of people who worked in the movie industry to renounce left-wing political beliefs and testify against one another. More than 500 people lost their jobs. Many of these blacklisted writers, directors, actors, and others were unable to work again for more than a decade. The committee also accused State Department workers of engaging in subversive activities. Soon, other anti-communist politicians, most notably Senator Joseph McCarthy, expanded this probe to include anyone who worked in the federal government. Thousands of federal employees were investigated, fired, and even prosecuted. As this anti-communist hysteria spread throughout the 1950s, liberal college professors lost their jobs, people were asked to testify against colleagues, and loyalty oaths became commonplace. The fight against subversion at home mirrored a growing concern with the Soviet threat abroad. In June of 1950, the first military action of the Cold War began when the Soviet-backed North Korean People's Army invaded its pro-Western neighbor to the south. Many American officials feared that this was the first step in a communist campaign to take over the world and deemed that non-intervention was not an option. Therefore, Truman sent the American military into Korea, but the war dragged to a stalemate and ended in 1953. Other international disputes followed. In the early 1960s, President Kennedy faced a number of troubling situations in his own hemisphere. The Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961 and the Cuban Missile Crisis the following year seemed to prove that the real communist threat now lay in the unstable, post-colonial Third World. Nowhere was this more apparent than Vietnam, where the collapse of the French colonial regime had led to a struggle between the American-backed nationalist Ngo Dien Diem in the south and the communist nationalist Ho Chi Minh in the north. Since the 1950s, the United States had been committed to the survival of an anti-communist government in the region, and by the early 1960s, it seemed clear to American leaders that if they were to successfully contain communist expansionism there, they would have to intervene more actively on Diem's behalf. However, what was intended to be a brief military action spiraled into a 10-year conflict. Almost as soon as he took office, President Richard Nixon began to implement a new approach to international relations. Instead of viewing the world as a hostile, bipolar place, he suggested, why not use diplomacy instead of military action to create more poles? To that end, he encouraged the United Nations to recognize the Communist Chinese government, and after a trip there in 1972, began to establish diplomatic relations with Beijing. At the same time, he adopted a policy of détente relaxation towards the Soviet Union. In 1972, he and Soviet Premier Leonid Brezhnev signed the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, which prohibited the manufacture of nuclear missiles by both sides and took a step towards reducing the decades-old threat of nuclear war. Despite Nixon's efforts, the Cold War heated up again under President Ronald Reagan. Like many leaders of his generation, Reagan believed that the spread of communism anywhere threatened freedom everywhere. As a result, he worked to provide financial and military aid to anti-communist governments and insurgencies around the world. This policy, particularly as it was applied in the developing world in places like Grenada and El Salvador, was known as the Reagan Doctrine. Even as Reagan fought communism in Central America, however, the Soviet Union was disintegrating. In response to severe economic problems and growing political ferment in the USSR, Premier Mikhail Gorbachev took office in 1985 and introduced two policies that redefined Russia's relationship to the rest of the world. The policies were known as political openness and economic reform. Soviet influence in Eastern Europe waned. In 1989, every other communist state in the region replaced its government with a non-communist one. In November of that year, the Berlin Wall, the most visible symbol of the decades-long Cold War, was finally destroyed, just over 2 years after Reagan had challenged the Soviet premier in a speech at Brandenburg Gate in Berlin. He said, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall." And by 1991, the Soviet Union itself had fallen apart. And finally, the Cold War was over.